Welcome to Women of Worth, where we address the issues that matter most to women around the world. Today, we're diving into a topic that is deeply serious yet crucial to discuss: violence against women. It's a reality faced by millions, affecting their mental health, physical well-being, and ability to live the lives they deserve. From physical and sexual violence to emotional abuse, the impacts are devastating, but together, we can make a difference. In this episode, we'll explore the root causes of violence against women, share real-life stories of courage and survival, and discuss actionable solutions to support survivors and break the cycle. You'll hear about women like Sophia, who found her independence after escaping a controlling partner, and Rosa, who used art to heal from sexual assault. These stories remind us that while the challenges are immense, hope and recovery are possible. If you care about creating a safer, more equitable world for women, stay with us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell to join the conversation. And we'd love to hear from you. How can we all contribute to ending violence against women? Let us know in the comments below. Now, let's begin this vital conversation and explore how we can support survivors, challenge harmful norms, and build a future where every woman feels safe and valued.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a topic that honestly impacts millions of people all around the world, and that's violence against women. We've got a ton of different sources that we're going to be going through. Right, research, we've got real-life accounts, and we've got global perspectives to kind of unpack. And we're doing all of this with the goal of better understanding really how violence shapes women's lives. So
it's definitely a sensitive topic, and it's one that we really need to approach with, a willingness to listen and learn. And I think what's so important about what we're going to uncover in these sources is just how pervasive violence against women is. We're going to get to see the real consequences that it has on women's well-being, on their sense of self, on their potential. It's really, it's an important conversation to have.
Yeah, for sure. And, one of the things that really jumped out at me while I was going through the material was that, we're not just talking about physical violence. I mean, obviously is a huge part of it, but it's also, sexual violence, emotional violence, or even like a really terrible combination of all three. And each of these types of violence can have, really serious ramifications on a woman's life.
Right. And that's what we're going to explore in this deep dive, right? We're going to look at how these different forms of violence impact a woman's mental health, her physical well-being, and also her ability to, achieve her goals, whether that's pursuing education, building a career, all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's, I think it's easy to think about violence against women. Mm. It's just like these isolated incidents that happen, every now and then. But the statistics paint a very different picture.
Yeah, it's actually estimated that 1 in 3 women globally has experienced some form of violence in their lifetime, and that's just a staggering figure. It really highlights just how urgent of an issue this is.
Yeah. Absolutely. And within that, we see that intimate partner violence is by far the most common form.
Yeah.
But again, it's not just physical. We also need to take into account the emotional and the sexual violence. How damaging can those things be?
Emotional abuse can be just as detrimental to a woman's health and well-being as physical violence. It really can. Mm-hmm. That constant belittling, manipulation, the control, it can really chip away at a woman's sense of self-worth. It can leave lasting scars.
You actually have a story that really illustrates this. Marie is a college student, and she talked about, how after months of just verbal abuse from her partner, she was constantly on edge.
Her story is one of many, sadly. Many women experience that. And what it highlights is that emotional abuse can lead to social anxiety. It can make it so difficult for women to just do everyday things like going to class, or just being around friends, socializing.
Yeah, it's like this weight that they're constantly carrying around with them. It makes it hard to focus on their studies, to build relationships, to just thrive.
Yeah.
And the impact goes way beyond just mental health too. The research also shows a very, very clear link between experiencing violence and then having these negative physical health outcomes.
The stress and the fear that come with abuse, it's constant. And that can really weaken the immune system. It makes women much more susceptible to illnesses.
We got a story from Sarah. She She endured years of domestic violence, and she started to suffer from chronic migraines, digestive issues, all kinds of things that she never had before.
Yeah, it's really a powerful reminder that the trauma of violence can show up in both, both emotional and physical ways. The body really keeps score, so to speak, and the long-term consequences, they can be devastating.
And then there's also just the impact on a woman's ability to pursue, her aspirations, to reach her full potential. Violence can completely derail a woman's education, derail her career, and make it just so difficult to achieve financial independence.
Yeah, it can completely trap women in these cycles of dependence and really limit their opportunities. We actually see that in Lisa's story. She was an entrepreneur, really a budding entrepreneur. She had a vision, a very clear vision for her business, but her spouse was very controlling, so she was forced to abandon those dreams. He restricted her access to networking opportunities. He restricted her access to financial resources, which essentially just stifled her growth.
It's heartbreaking to see, how these things can play out. So given the complexities and just the sheer scale of this issue, I mean, where do we even begin to understand these root causes?
Well, the sources that we looked at actually point to several interconnected factors. I think one of the most prominent ones, though, is this pervasive influence of cultural norms and gender inequality.
Okay, I'm curious about that. What exactly do we mean when we talk about cultural norms, and how do they contribute to this violence against women?
Well, think about it. The messages that we get from our families, from our communities, from the media, they often reinforce very traditional gender roles. They put men in positions of dominance and women in these subordinate roles.
So it's about these ingrained beliefs about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman in society.
Exactly. And that can lead to this dangerous power imbalance where men feel entitled to control women. And violence becomes a tool, really, for maintaining that control. And in many cultures, if a woman dares to step outside of these rigid expectations, she faces backlash, even violence for that.
So it's not just individual acts of aggression. It's really woven into the fabric of the structures of society.
That's a really important point. And it brings us to another factor that contributes to violence, and that's the dynamics of power and control within relationships themselves.
This is where, it's really important to understand that violence isn't always overt. It's not always physical. Sometimes it's much more subtle, more insidious.
Absolutely. Abusers use all kinds of tactics to exert power and control over their partners. It could be isolating them from their loved ones. It could be monitoring their communications or controlling their finances. Really, it's all about making the victim feel completely powerless, like they're trapped.
And we actually see that dynamic reflected in the research on economic dependence, right? One of the studies that we looked at found that women who come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds are actually more likely to stay in abusive relationships because of the financial constraints.
Yeah, and it creates this vicious cycle, The abuser tightens their control over the finances. That makes it even harder for the women to leave, which further solidifies their power over her.
But it underscores this need for us to have support systems that not only address the immediate safety concerns, but also look at the long-term economic empowerment of women.
Absolutely. Another really important factor that was highlighted in the sources we looked at is the normalization of abuse, particularly for people who grew up witnessing violence, like they saw it as a regular occurrence.
Yeah, this is a difficult thing to talk about, but it's really important. So how does that normalization actually affect how individuals perceive and experience violence?
Growing up in environments where violence is commonplace can tragically lead to people accepting it as normal behavior. And that can make it so difficult to even recognize that it's abuse, both as a victim, but also as a potential perpetrator.
So really, we need to start having conversations about healthy relationships, about consent and respect, like from a very young age.
I completely agree. Education is key to breaking those cycles of violence and creating a culture of respect and equality. In the last segment, we were talking about all those really deep-rooted causes of violence against women, right? And we kind of start to unpack how, cultural norms and the dynamics of power, and then also this normalization of abuse, like how all those things contribute to this problem. And it really is a global issue. But I think now we need to shift gears a little bit and talk about, well, what are those solutions?
Right.
What can we actually do? It can feel overwhelming when you think about the scale of the problem, but every single action that we take, no matter how small, can help to create a safer world for women. That's
a message of hope, and I think that's something that we all need to hear. So where do we begin? What can we actually do to support survivors and to work towards preventing this violence?
I think one of the most powerful things, and really the most immediate thing that we can do, is just listen. Listen without judgment. Survivors of violence, they carry so much shame and fear, and so we need to create a space for them where they feel safe to share their experiences.
So what does that look like in practice? How can we be better listeners for the survivors in our lives?
I think it starts with being compassionate, being empathetic, really listening to what they have to say without blaming them or interrogating them, instead of saying, why didn't you leave? Which can actually make a survivor feel very judged and defensive. Instead, try saying something like, I'm here for you, how can I help?
That's a very subtle but important shift in language. It moves away from questioning their choices and focuses on offering support.
Yeah, exactly. It's about validating their experiences and making sure they know that you believe them and you support them. And beyond listening, it's also really important to connect survivors to the right resources, shelters, hotlines, counseling services. These can be lifelines for women who are in crisis.
Yeah, and actually some of the organizations that we came across in the research, they're doing some pretty incredible work in this area.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about some of those for our listeners?
Yeah, definitely. So organizations like the Women's Aid and the National Domestic Violence Hotline, these are great examples. They offer 247 support and a wide range of services. So everything from like crisis intervention to safety planning, legal advocacy, and even just referrals for counseling services.
It seems like those resources would be so crucial, especially in those initial stages when a survivor might feel really overwhelmed and lost and unsure about where to even turn.
Absolutely. And then in the longer term, encouraging survivors to seek therapy. That can be incredibly beneficial. Processing trauma, rebuilding self-esteem, those are really essential steps on the path to healing.
We heard from Mia earlier, it's the college student who was experiencing that emotional abuse. And through counseling, she was actually able to find her voice and learn to set boundaries. She's starting to rebuild her life.
Right. And her experience really highlights how therapy can give survivors that power, to reclaim their sense of self and to really navigate those challenges of healing. And it's so important to remember, too, that every survivor's journey is going to be unique. We have to respect their decisions, even if those decisions don't align with what we think they should be doing.
That's such an important point. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What do you mean by respecting their decisions?
Well, it means understanding that a survivor might not be ready to leave an abusive situation right away. And there could be so many reasons for that. And it's really not our place to judge those choices.
So how do we walk that line between offering support, but also making sure that we're respecting their autonomy?
I think we can do that by helping them to create a safety plan, connecting them with those resources that we talked about, offering unconditional support, but not pressuring them to make decisions that they're not ready for. Leaving is often the most dangerous time for a survivor, so making sure that they are safe, that has to be the top priority.
The research that we looked at also emphasizes how important it is to promote financial independence for survivors.
Yeah, and that is really a key piece of this puzzle. Economic dependence can be one of the biggest barriers for women to leave an abusive relationship. So programs that offer skills training, job placement assistance, or even microloans, these are so vital because they give women those tools and those resources that they need to build a life that is free from that financial control.
We saw this play out in Anna's story. She was a single mother. She was trapped in an abusive relationship. And after she participated in a skills training program, she was able to get a stable job, she got financial independence, and finally she was able to leave that abusive environment.
Yeah, and her experience just really shows us how transformative economic empowerment can be, right? It gives survivors that agency, those means to break free from the cycle of abuse. But, these individual solutions, those are essential, but we also need to think bigger. We need to think about those broader societal changes that need to happen.
Okay, so let's zoom out a little bit. What are some of the ways that we can tackle this issue on a larger scale?
Well, I think, education awareness campaigns are huge. We need to start early, Teaching young people about healthy relationships, about consent, about respect.
Are there any good examples of this type of education being implemented effectively?
Yeah, actually, there are some schools that have started to integrate these kinds of programs, where they focus on these topics, and they've actually seen a really positive impact. They've seen a reduction in bullying, a reduction in incidents of gender-based violence. So that kind of early intervention, it's crucial.
It sounds like it's not just about reacting to the violence after it's already occurred. It's about being proactive and really creating a culture of respect and equality.
That's exactly right. And along with education, we need stronger legal protections too. We need to make sure that the laws that are already in place are being enforced. Laws against domestic violence, sexual assault, harassment.
It's not enough to just have these laws written down somewhere. We need to make sure that they're actually being implemented, that perpetrators are being held accountable for their actions.
I completely agree. And then another really important piece of the puzzle is strengthening those community support networks. So organizations like Circle of Hope, they're creating these safe spaces where survivors can connect with one another, get emotional support, and also practical assistance.
It seems like having that sense of community, having that shared experience, that could be incredibly powerful for healing, for rebuilding. It gives people resilience. It shows them they're not alone in this.
Absolutely. And then we also shouldn't overlook the potential of family counseling, and interventions. Addressing those abusive behaviors within the family, that can help break the cycle of violence that's being passed down from one generation to the next.
So really getting to the root of the problem, right?
Exactly. And then, we talked about how vital economic empowerment programs are, right? Giving women access to education, job training, and financial resources. That can be so transformative. It can help break those cycles of dependence and abuse.
And we saw this with the microfinance initiative, right? Where they were able to help dozens of survivors to start their own businesses. And that gave them not only financial independence, but also this renewed sense of agency. Like they were in control of their own lives again.
It's a perfect example of how when you empower women economically, it creates this ripple effect, right? It has this positive impact, not only on their own lives, but on their families, on their communities. And now I think it's really interesting to kind of broaden our perspective a little bit and look at what different cultures around the world are doing to address this issue.
Yeah, this is where it gets fascinating. I'm really curious to learn about how different societies are tackling this very, very complex problem.
Yeah, and we have to acknowledge that there's no one solution that's going to fit every situation, right? Every culture has its own unique context, its own challenges, its own opportunities, but we can learn a lot from each other. We can look at what's working in different places.
Let's start with the Scandinavian model. That's one that's gotten a lot of attention for its success in reducing the rates of violence against women.
Right. So Scandinavian countries, they've really made gender equality a central focus. They've enacted some really strong laws and implemented these really comprehensive policies that are specifically aimed at addressing violence.
So it's a multi-pronged approach. They're combining those legal deterrents with a commitment to changing cultural norms.
Exactly. So, for example, Sweden, they've seen a 25% decrease in reported domestic violence cases since they implemented these measures. They really emphasize early education, they've got strong social safety nets, and there's this real focus on holding the perpetrators accountable for their actions.
That's really impressive. What about other regions? Are there any examples of effective approaches being used in developing countries?
Absolutely. In Africa, we're seeing a real surge in grassroots movements that are working specifically to address violence against women. So you've got organizations in Kenya, Uganda, they're working with community leaders, they're challenging those harmful cultural norms that we talked about earlier, and they're providing direct support to the survivors.
So it sounds like it's more of a bottom-up approach where they're working within the communities to create lasting change.
That's right. And these movements are gaining momentum. They're really starting to make a difference. Sustainable change, it has to come from addressing those root causes of violence and empowering women at every level.
What about Asia? Are there any notable initiatives or cultural shifts that are happening over there?
There's definitely a growing awareness of the problem.
Yeah.
And we're seeing a lot of different initiatives that are aimed at promoting gender equality and empowering women. So there's this campaign in India called Beti Padhao, which translates to save the daughter, educate the daughter. And that campaign is really focused on challenging those patriarchal attitudes and investing in girls' education.
It's really encouraging to see these diverse approaches popping up all around the world. Feels like there's this collective recognition that violence against women, this is a global problem and it needs a global response.
Yeah, and it does. And, we've been talking about all these promising solutions, but I think it's really important to remember that change doesn't happen overnight. This is going to take sustained effort, it's going to take collaboration, and it's going to take a real commitment to challenging the status quo.
Before we move on, I think it would be really powerful to share some of those real life stories of resilience. Hearing about how women have overcome these challenges, that can inspire hope.
Yeah.
I think you can give some really valuable insights to people who might be going through similar situations.
Yeah, I agree. These stories really show us the strength and the courage of these women who've been through such incredibly difficult circumstances.
We've got a few different stories to share. Where do you want to start?
Let's start with Sophia. She was a marketing professional, and she endured years of emotional abuse from her partner. He controlled her finances, he isolated her from her friends and family, and he was constantly monitoring her every move.
It's that classic pattern of coercive control, right? Mm-hmm. Where the abuser is trying to systematically undermine the victim's sense of self and their ability to make decisions for themselves.
That's right. And Sophia was living in fear. She was afraid to leave because she was worried about financial instability, and she was worried about being judged by other people.
But she did find a way out.
She did. So she confided in a friend, and that friend connected her with a women's support group. And through that group, Sophia was able to connect with other women who understood her experience, who could offer her encouragement, and who could give her some practical guidance.
That kind of support network can be such a lifeline for someone who's feeling isolated and overwhelmed.
It really was for Sophia. The support group helped her to get legal aid, and they connected her with a financial empowerment program. And with their guidance, she was able to find a safe place to live. She started therapy, and she eventually got a better job. She was able to reclaim her independence.
It's a really inspiring story. It shows us that with the right support, it is possible to rebuild your life. What about Leila's story? What challenges did she face?
So Leila was a teacher, and she was experiencing physical violence from her husband, and they had just moved to a new city, so she was even more isolated from her family and her support network. She was constantly living in fear. She was hiding the abuse from her colleagues, from her friends, from everyone.
And that isolation, that's another tactic that abusers often use. It's a way to cut the victim off from any potential sources of help.
Yeah, exactly. But one night, after a particularly scary incident, Leila found the courage to confide in a colleague, someone that she trusted.
Wow, that must have been incredibly difficult for her to do.
It really was, but it turned out to be a turning point in her life, because her colleague connected her with a local shelter. And with the help of the shelter, Leila was able to get a restraining order against her husband, and she started to rebuild her life.
So sometimes all it takes is that one act of courage, reaching out to one person. That can make all the difference.
It can. And Leila's story also really highlights just how vital those shelters are. They provide immediate safety. They provide support for women who are fleeing violence. Now, what about Amara's story? Have you heard about her?
I haven't. What kind of challenges was she facing?
So Amara was a software developer, and she was dealing with sexual harassment from a senior colleague at work.
So sad, but that's a very common experience, especially for women who are working in male-dominated fields.
It is. And when Amara first reported the harassment to her company's HR department, they were really dismissive. They basically told her to just ignore it.
It's so frustrating that a lot of companies are still prioritizing protecting their reputation over actually supporting the victims of harassment.
It is, unfortunately. But Amara, she refused to be silenced. She went to a women's advocacy group, and they gave her legal counsel, and they encouraged her to document every single incident of harassment, and she did.
Having that kind of external support, having people to guide her through that process, that must have been so empowering for her.
It was. So armed with all of this evidence and with legal representation, she filed a formal complaint with the company, and it led to an investigation, and eventually the harasser was dismissed.
That's such a great example of how speaking up and seeking support can actually lead to justice.
It is. And Amara didn't stop there. She's actually become a mentor now for other women who are working in the tech industry who are facing similar challenges. She's using her own experience to empower other women and to make the workplace a more supportive environment.
These stories are amazing. They're just a glimpse, really, into the diverse experiences of these women who face violence, but they highlight how important resilience is, how important those support networks are, and having access to resources. They really show us that even when you're facing these incredible challenges, there's still hope for healing. There's still a path towards reclaiming your life.
I agree. And while these stories are definitely hopeful, they also remind us that there's still so much work to do. We've got to keep fighting to address this issue.
So in the final part of this deep dive, I think we need to move from understanding the problem and exploring all the solutions and really start to look at the concrete action that each of us can take. We've got to create a world where women are safe and they're empowered. So we're going to delve into the practical steps that people can take, from educating ourselves, challenging those harmful norms that we keep talking about, advocating for policy changes, and also looking at how we can engage men and boys as allies in this fight.
Okay, so we've spent the last two parts of this deep dive really kind of digging into this complex issue of violence against women. We've talked about the devastating impacts, the really deep-rooted causes, and we've also heard some pretty inspiring stories about resilience.
And I think the good news is that there are things that we can do. There are concrete steps that each of us can take to be part of the solution. And, sometimes it feels like, oh, what I do doesn't really matter. It's just a small thing. But even those small actions can create a ripple effect. They can really lead to big changes.
I love that. So where do we begin?
I think one of the most basic things, but it's also one of the most important things, is just educating ourselves and then educating other people. Mm-hmm. The more we understand about violence against women, the different forms that it takes, the warning signs, the resources that are available, the better equipped we are to actually do something about it.
Right. So knowledge is power. But how do we take that knowledge and put it into action?
I think we can start by being supportive allies to the survivors in our lives. It could be, a friend, a family member, a colleague, someone that we work with. Listen to them without judging them, believe their stories, and help them to get professional support if that's what they need.
So really it's about creating that space where they feel safe to share what they're going through. They don't feel like they're going to be blamed or shamed for what's happened to them.
Exactly. And even if someone doesn't come to us directly and share their experience, we can still be supportive by speaking out. If we hear someone telling a joke that's harmful or perpetuating a stereotype, we can challenge that. We can speak up when we see sexist attitudes or behaviors.
I think it's easy to underestimate how powerful those little actions can be in shifting the culture.
They really are. And speaking of shifting the culture, we can also advocate for policies that are going to protect women. We can advocate for policies that are going to hold perpetrators accountable for their actions. And there's so many ways to do that. We can support organizations that are working to change laws. We can contact our elected officials. We can sign petitions. We can, go to marches and rallies.
It's about using our voices to create pressure, to get those people in power to actually make those changes.
Absolutely. And I think we can't forget about the role that men and boys play in all of this.
It feels like a conversation that doesn't happen often enough. Mm. So how do we get men and boys involved in this movement?
We need to encourage them to be allies. We need to teach boys from a young age about respect, about empathy, about what a healthy relationship looks like. We've got to break down those gender stereotypes that can often lead to violence.
Yeah, it's about challenging those messages that they're getting from society and showing them they have a really important role to play in creating a world that's more just, that's more equitable.
Exactly. And for men, it's about, speaking out against misogyny, speaking out against sexism. It's about calling out behaviors when you see them, when you see something that's not right. And it's about actively supporting women, both in their personal lives and in their professional lives.
There are some great organizations out there who are doing this work.
Yeah, absolutely. He4She is a great example. It's a global solidarity movement for gender equality, and they're really focused on mobilizing men and boys to be advocates for change. They're challenging those deep-seated norms that perpetuate violence, and they're working to create this culture where men are standing up for women's rights and safety.
So to recap, we can all make a difference in this. We can educate ourselves, we can support the survivors in our lives, we can advocate for policy changes, and we can engage men and boys as allies.
That's a great summary. And I think the important thing is to remember that even those small actions that we talked about earlier, they can make a difference. Every time we have a conversation with someone, every time we challenge a stereotype, every act of support that we offer, it all contributes to creating a world that's safer, that's more equitable for women.
It's about shifting the culture one conversation at a time, one action at a time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've really explored the complexity of violence against women. We talked about the devastating impacts. We talked about the root causes. And we also highlighted some solutions and some really inspiring stories. And I think as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a question. What small step can you take today? What can you do today to challenge those harmful norms that we've been talking about? Or to support someone who might be in need? It doesn't have to be a huge thing. It could be as simple as starting a conversation with someone or sharing an article that you read that you found helpful. Maybe it's donating to an organization that's working to end violence against women.
Those small actions can add up to something really big. Don't underestimate your ability to make a difference. And to anyone out there who's listening, if you're experiencing violence or if you know someone who is, you're not alone. There are resources out there that can help.
Absolutely. And, I just want to thank everyone for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a really important conversation to have. And I hope that it's given everyone who's listening a better understanding of this issue. And I hope that it's inspired you to take action.
That's what we're hoping for. This episode resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this with someone who might need to hear this message. So until next time, stay curious and keep learning.